This, the 13th lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, examines the causes and policy responses to the Great Depression of the 1930s. When the inevitable occurred, the people looked to their leaders for answers and for action. Their leaders looked to the experts, who had plenty of excuses but few solutions. Many economists accepted the business cycle as normal and inevitable, with recession and even depression as the cost of too rapid growth. However, there were voices of dissent coming forward. In 1928, a Mormon banker from Ogden, Utah, named Mariner Eccles, was one of a small number of astute business people who recognized the serious weaknesses in the U.S. economy. Yet even Eccles thought the Federal Reserve System was up to the challenge of maintaining stable economic growth simply by managing the supply of credit. Eccles wrote at the time, "The best tribute to the efficiency of the Federal Reserve System is that no panic has developed since its inception. Bigger and better banks are predicted as one of the most important consequences of the Federal Reserve System." The trend was slow at first, but during the Great Depression and then over the following decades, despite increased government regulation and oversight, thousands of banks failed or were acquired by larger banks, and larger banks merged with one another. Periods of deregulation were followed by periods of instability and more bank failures, followed beginning in the 1970s by even more deregulation as the accepted solution to future instability. Just a few years after Eccles expressed confidence in the future, the nation's economy fell deeper and deeper into the Great Depression. Eccles reflected on the causes and addressed his fellow bankers. The solution to the Depression is not an easy one and will not correct itself as some people like to believe. The causes lie too deep and are too complex and widespread to be removed easily. This cartoon from the era expresses the public frustration. Eccles revealed his pragmatic approach to economic problems by breaking with mainstream economists and calling for government action. He understood one very basic fact, which is that politics dictates economic outcomes. The difficulty, of course, is in first identifying and then implementing laws and regulations that promote the common good. As Eccles saw the situation, he wrote, "Economics is merely the production and distribution of wealth, brought about by the application of labor to raw materials. It is all man-made, in the sense that it is subjected at once to man-made rules and regulations, which are changed constantly in accordance with the needs of a dynamic society." Here, Eccles essentially paraphrases Henry George's description of the operation of political economies. Wealth is what we produce from nature, from raw materials. What George adds is a moral judgment, which is that nature is the common fund, our common wealth, from which wealth as private property is produced. Campaigning for the presidency, Franklin D. Roosevelt called for a balanced budget and an end to wasteful spending. After taking office, he had to become pragmatic, though not right out of the gate. However, he promised the electorate he would not stand by and watch them suffer. He declared, "If starvation and dire need on the part of our citizens make necessary the appropriation of additional funds which would keep the budget out of balance, I shall not hesitate to tell the American people the truth and ask them to authorize the expenditure of that additional amount." The economic downturn worsened after passage of the Tariff Act of 1930, sponsored by U.S. Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Hawley. The measure increased tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to the second highest level in U.S. history. Economists had warned of dire consequences, to no avail. Testifying before the U.S. Senate Finance Committee in March of 1933, Marino Eccles bluntly chastised the government for a trade policy that guaranteed the Depression would only worsen. He recalled in 1951, "I pointed out that debts between nations could ultimately be paid only in goods, gold, or services, or a combination of these three. But the pressure on our foreign debtors to pay their obligations held in this country ran parallel with our restrictive tariff policies. Since foreign debtors could not sell a sufficient amount of goods to meet their dollar needs, they could pay their obligations only by shipments of gold." Furthermore, since this process led to our acquiring a good part of the world's gold supply, the loss of gold in foreign lands forced many of them off the gold standard and tended to bring about a depreciation of their currencies so that they could produce goods at costs that would offset the effects of our high tariffs. All of this boomeranged on us. A global economy under enormous stress was brought to its knees by wrong-headed policy decisions that dramatically reduced international trade between countries. In March of 1933, Eccles wrote a long memorandum to Secretary of War George Dern, severely criticizing Roosevelt's public commitment to a balanced budget. Dern read the memorandum aloud at a meeting of the cabinet. At the same time, Secretary of the Treasury Will Woodin opposed the proposal by Eccles for a government guarantee of bank deposits. Later in the year, however, a new banking act established the FDIC, and E.G. Bennett, of the same banking group as Eccles in Utah, was appointed one of 3 directors. The banking system was saved from probable collapse. At the same time, the introduction of protection for depositors opened the door for banks to undertake even more riskier types of business lending. Early in 1934, Henry Morgenthau Jr. recruited Eccles as an advisor to the Treasury Department. Only months later, Eccles was appointed governor of the Federal Reserve Board. As to the challenges of his new position, Eccles stated, "I felt that in a depression the proper role of government should be that of generating a maximum degree of private spending through a minimum amount of public spending." For Eccles, the key question was how much in federal spending was sufficient to get the economy growing again and people employed. With money in short supply, some local communities had already taken the step of issuing their own scrip. By mid-1932, the phenomenon of stamp scrip gained publicity as a result of a successful experiment in Hawarden, Iowa, and its subsequent promotion by economist Irving Fisher of Yale University. Early in 1933, this marked the high point of scrip issues. Millions of people without access to cash were living by barter, and at least several hundred municipalities in the United States issued some form of scrip. In the early 1970s, Ralph Borsodi, one of the leaders of the decentralist movement and founder of the School of Living, together with a few associates, developed and launched a currency experiment called the Constant. Concerned about the chronic inflation resulting from official debasement of the dollar, Borsodi conceived a privately issued currency which would hold its value. Borsodi's basic strategy for making his currency inflation-proof was to make it redeemable for a market basket assortment of basic commodities. The development of the constant never progressed far, but the constants that were issued were backed by bank deposits of dollars. Constants circulated successfully for almost 2 years and enjoyed wide acceptance by the public. At its peak, the equivalent of about $160,000 in constants was circulating throughout southern New Hampshire and elsewhere, both in the form of paper currency and as checking account balances at several area banks. The Banking Act of 1933, commonly referred to as the Glass-Steagall Act after its two congressional architects, established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and introduced banking reforms they believed would dampen the speculative nature of finance. Most importantly, bank holding companies were prohibited from owning other financial companies. Additionally, commercial banks were prohibited from using their own assets to invest in securities, such as stocks and bonds. The economic collapse might have been made less severe had Roosevelt and his advisors paid attention to the advice provided by the philosopher John Dewey in a radio address made in 1932. Dewey had studied and absorbed Henry George. In his 1932 radio address, he told his fellow citizens this: "Everybody recognizes the stock market orgy of our late boom days. Only a few realize the extent to which speculation in land is the source of many troubles of the farmer, the part it has played in loading banks and insurance companies with frozen assets, and compelling the closing of thousands of banks, nor how the high rents, the unpayable mortgages, and the slums of the cities are connected with speculation in land values." Dewey continued, pointing to what he believed to be the fundamental flaw in the American system. The community's acquisition of its own creation, ground rent value, would both reduce the price of land and entirely eliminate taxes on improvement, thus making ownership easier. And how anyone expects to solve the unemployment question by putting the sanction of both legality and high pecuniary reward upon the ability of the few to keep the many from equal access to land and to the raw material without which labor is impossible, I do not see, and no one else does. For the tinkerers assume that unemployment must continue only with government assistance to those who are necessarily out of work. As the United States slipped back into depression in 1937, economics professor Harry Gunnison Brown declared his deep frustration with the actions of the nation's leaders for ignoring the one set of policies that were so desperately needed. Brown wrote, "Why don't our legislators consider the land question? Why don't they do something about the land speculation that forces concentration of workers upon smaller space and forces the use of poorer and less well-situated land, so necessarily reducing the level of real wages at which men can be employed? Why, in short, do they pass laws which merely pretend to raise wages, while they steadfastly refuse to consider a taxation system which would make higher wages really possible? Why ignore the fact that taxes on the various goods and services workers must buy now take from these workers a substantial part of their wages, while the untaxing of land makes land expensive for business and for homes, breeds tenancy, and reduces the productivity of labor?" And in an article he wrote for the Freeman in 1938, Brown asked other disturbing questions. Does our boasted free education leave our people as fundamentally unintelligent and as susceptible to make-believe as if they had no education at all? And will it therefore continue to be the case that success in politics flows not from real understanding and not from getting at the causes of our economic evils and seeking to remove these causes, but from pretense and plausible quackery and make-believe. Brown and those few other academic colleagues who shared his views proved powerless in their efforts to correct the theoretical shortcomings and biases embedded in the teaching of economics. This troubled Brown for the rest of his life. And from the time of Franklin Roosevelt on, the one consistent government policy has been to keep spending, regardless of whether there was sufficient revenue raised by taxation or other means. The economic arguments for public spending came from the British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued, if 2/3 or 3/4 of total investment is carried out or can be influenced by public or semi-public bodies, a long-term program of a stable character should be capable of reducing the potential range of fluctuation to much narrower limits than formerly, when a smaller volume of investment was under public control, and when even this part tended to follow, rather than correct, fluctuations of investment in the strictly private sector of the economy. The main task should be to prevent large fluctuations by a stable long-term program. If this is successful, it should not be too difficult to offset small fluctuations by expediting or retarding some items in this long-term program. Another consistent policy of most governments, that of the United States included, is a reliance on borrowing from those with the highest incomes and most financial wealth, rather than imposing sufficiently high taxation on those with the most ability to pay. How income is derived is rarely part of the discussion. Historians are in general agreement that none of the measures adopted under Roosevelt's New Deal actually brought the Great Depression to an end. The mitigating effects of the New Deal ran into a wall in 1937 as President Roosevelt curtailed spending in favor of balancing the federal budget, as advised by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. Mariner Eccles warned that this shift in policy was premature, given the tenuous state of the economy. By the spring of 1938, Roosevelt realized his mistake and pushed the Congress to approve spending for a renewed public works program. Although many Americans were hurting and certainly confused by what they were experiencing, they retained faith in the American system, the public sector expanding under the guidance of liberals drawn to government service. Elsewhere around the globe, desperate people were being subjected to desperate measures by reactionary governments. This prompted Austrian-born economist Peter F. Drucker at the beginning of 1939 to add his voice to those warning of what was evolving. Economic progress does not bring equality, not even the formal equality of equal opportunity. It brings instead the new and extremely rigid unequal classes of the petty bourgeoisie, into which it is as difficult to graduate from the proletariat, at least in Europe, as it is difficult to rise out of them into the class of entrepreneurs. If the classes of modern industrial society are not hereditary by law, they have almost become so in fact. Even in the United States, the ideal of the democracy seemed to be gone, not merely threatened, replaced by an entrenched class system. Although global war, the full employment it stimulated, and the social welfare programs that followed provided a reprieve, but only a reprieve. We reach the end of Lesson 13.